This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katherine Shen. Out of curiosity, can you remember the last time you were curious about something? Like that tree you see right outside of your window. What species is it? Or the pair of friends who just walked by speaking in a language you don't understand? What's their story? I'll let those questions sit for a second. Don't panic if you can't remember a specific moment. We're all a lot more curious than we think. But sometimes things get in the way, like fear, time, trauma, or distance. Today, we're going to dive deep into how curiosity can be an antidote to fear and how it can deepen our connection with ourselves and with each other. With us is Scott Shigeoka. He's the author of Seek, How Curiosity Can Transform Your Life and Change the World. Thank you so much, Scott, for being here today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So this is actually an extra exciting moment for me because Scott and I went to college together. And I remember, I have a very distinct memory of you sharing with me so many years back what were inklings to what ended up being this massive adventure that led to this book. And so you opened up the pages by stating curiosity is a superpower, which I thought was just great. And so this journey, can you talk about how did you get curious about getting curious?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the big piece that I wanted to share was in 2017, I went on a trip to Joshua Tree, and it was a seemingly normal nature trip, except for the fact that I started to have and experience auditory hallucinations. I started to hear these voices that said really nasty things to me. You know, you're worthless. You don't belong here. And it was very scary. And I tried to push them away, and they just kept coming back again and again. And this happened for days, and then weeks, and then months. And so I went to my therapist to, a specialized therapist to figure out, what was going on here. And he had asked me a really interesting question, which was, have you ever tried getting curious about the voices? And that was really, I was like, you want me to get curious about the thing that I fear?
Right, which is why you're there in the first place.
Yeah. I was like, but, he was very confident about this being an approach that would be helpful for me. And so I started to really think about, where were these voices coming from? What were they saying? Were they similar to any other things that I had heard before in my life? And what I realized over time was that those voices mirrored what I had told myself or what I had heard as a young person. And that especially when I was feeling shame or when I was getting bullied for, my sexual identity or for my social awkwardness or any parts of, who I was and how I was being in the world. And it revealed to me this younger version of myself that was so desperately wanting to heal. And, eventually through time and through the help of, my therapist, I was able to navigate that really, really scary time and was able to realize that these voices were actually something I could love. They weren't dark forces that I needed to repel, but they were actually teaching me something and showing me something new. And that really inspired me on a professional level to think about, are there other things in my life that I'm pushing away, that I'm seeing as like a dark force that I actually could be more curious about? That I actually could be replacing my certainty with curiosity about. And at that time, it was around, the 2016 elections, and there was, a lot of division here in the United States, which is still, happening to this day. Division across, all kinds of social identities, but also political polarization, where we are judging people because of how they voted in the last election or because they have an identity that seems to clash with our own. And that was really the anchor for this entire journey, was like, how can I get curious about that? and would I find the same to be true, where I would eventually love the people that I once feared, where I would see the value in them that I once did not see? Would I be able to learn something new like I had with my voices?
Well, and I think it's amazing how that one seemingly simple question led to this amazing and what I assume to be an ongoing journey. for you, I think both personally and professionally. And so
Yeah.
so then it kind of led to this really big decision you made where
Mhm.
you dropped everything and you went on this massive road trip. And I remember you describing to me, you were hitchhiking your way, state across state, and exploring the U.S. And I remember thinking that's just it's so mind blowing, the idea of being able to do that and to talk to different people, like you're saying, sort of crossing barriers while you have your own sort of insecurities or fear and whatnots. And so what were you hoping to accomplish? Because it sounds like you wanted to challenge your own assumptions and maybe sort of work through some of the fear that you were just describing.
hmm Yeah, so I wasn't hitchhiking. I was traveling around in my Toyota Prius, which I took
Okay.
out the back seats and I put in a little bed and I was like sharing at Planet Fitness. It was like a very like, van life kind of situation, but without the height clearance, I
Okay.
guess.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But uh yeah, one of the big intentions was, I do a lot of research on this topic. So this wasn't just like I one day decided to do this. I work at the UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center where we're really exploring how does one live a meaningful life? How does one improve our well-being and our relationships to one another? And what does the science say about the practices that we could bring into our lives to do that work? And one of the big ahas I had in that work is really the power of curiosity, especially on this topic of division. That if we want to navigate the division in our lives because we're about to meet people in our family at the holiday reunion, who feel very differently than us, or voted very differently from us, or maybe in our workplace, we're trying to navigate some tensions or some differences, or at the parent teacher, conference that's
Hmm.
happening, wherever you're finding the division in your own life, like I'm speaking directly to the listeners, I saw the power through the research of curiosity as a way to reduce tension, to help people navigate through conflict, to help people feel closer to the people that they disagreed with, and to have more effective dialogue and strengthen their connection even. And I think for me, what I was hoping for as I was going on this trip was I'm going to go and travel for a whole year in my Toyota Prius to, Trump rallies. And I'm going to go to meet with religious communities. And I'm going to live in rural towns for months at a time, places that I hadn't really been exposed to as someone who self-identifies as queer and progressive and has spent most of my adult life in the San Francisco Bay Area. I wanted to understand, could I use curiosity and practice it, just like the research tells me, on
Hmm.
my own with people who are very different from me? And then what would that mean for the rest of us, the rest of the people in my family and my community, in our country? And so that was sort of the impetus to it. And I had such incredible experiences that taught me a lot at all of those, different spaces. But it did reinforce by the end of it that yes, curiosity is something that we can always come back to as a companion that really helped me personally, get through these very scary situations. They were scary for me. They brought up a lot of fear, but in the end allowed me to find connection, to help me understand people I felt like I could never understand a little better. And I also felt like I was seen, which was very
Hmm.
surprising. And I would later find out that in the research, when we are practicing curiosity, it is more likely that others will practice curiosity towards us. So it makes sense then that not only did I learn something about others, but they learned something about me and my identities and my perspectives. And so I thought that was a really beautiful outcome too.
Well, and I think you make a very important point in terms of there's the experiential sort of lesson where it's one thing to read about it in a
Hmm
research paper or
hmm
whatnots, right? Versus you actually going out to do the thing and experience it. And so can you describe some of those moments? I think one of the more, not more, but one of the most beautiful things about your book is to I think you really take the reader into those moments that you were having, the people that you were meeting. Those really came to life, and I feel like when I was reading, I felt like I was experiencing it my own. Especially as a journalist, I have gone through those spaces, but that was as a
hmm
journalist versus maybe not a personal me per se. So can you
hmm
like talk about some of those moments? What I'm sure there's so many that jumps out to you, but what was a
Yeah.
moment where you had that like you did not expect to connect with somebody that you felt like you had nothing in common, but at the end of the day, you realize you're both human beings.
Yeah, I think just because of my own political beliefs and ideologies, I was really afraid. I remember at the first Trump rally I went to, I was so afraid of everything that was going on in our country and who I was about to encounter, to be really honest with you. And when I went there and I saw the sea of red, a lot of anger, a lot of fear, a lot of these like emotions came up within me, but mostly fear, to be honest with you. I was really afraid about how I would be received, what I would hear, how this experience would make me feel. And I spent hours at this rally just having conversations with folks. And what I remember one man individual who I was talking to, who said we started having this conversation just about, like, oh, our upbringings, and it was just very like small talk in the beginning. Oh, like, here's, I'm on this trip. Oh wow, that's really interesting. We just kind of went back and forth. But eventually, this conversation of othering came up. This feeling that he had around his girlfriend. His girlfriend is on the opposite side of him politically, and her friends are as well. And he felt like every time he was around them, they would just chastise him and they would other him and demonize him and judge him, and that made him feel really upset. And I actually was able to, you know, join in his feelings of othering by saying, I know exactly what you mean, because I just recently had an experience where I was in, Minnesota, in a small town, and I was with my partner, and we were being physically threatened, because of we were holding hands during a love song at a concert, which is what every other couple was doing. And it made me feel so othered and ostracized, and it didn't make me feel safe. And we had this really connection with our two different experiences of, wow, like these are two moments where people felt othered for different reasons, whether it's identities or ideologies we've had, and just the pain that it caused us. And I think what was also beautiful about that was we found this common ground to sit on. We were very different. We would later find out in many of the policy issues and many of the not necessarily the goals for our country, but how we would get there. But we did have were these human stories beyond the politics or before the politics, that we could connect on. And he saw me in a way that I think he hadn't seen someone who had a queer identity. Like he told me that he had never met someone who was gay. And I said, well, you might have met someone who was queer, but they might have not just told you that they were queer. So we had this really beautiful connection that was really human, that I think taught us both a lot about each other. And hopefully the interaction for both of us made us realize that we always have to find the individuality of someone. We can't just see their group identities, whether they are Asian American, whether they are, Democrat or queer or Republican or voted for Trump or whatever their identities are, and just assume we know everything about them. We can't just be certain we have all the information we have because we have that one identifier. We have to continue to be curious about who this individual is, to see their personal stories, to find out more about them, because we might actually be delightfully surprised that there's so much we share.
And do you think that's one of those moments was that a moment where you were shocked, or a learning moment where you realized that, wow, being curious could actually be one of the tools we need, but also recognizing that it has to be reacted to. Like the other person also has to be curious towards you in order to have a conversation or to have a constructive conversation.
Yeah, what the research shows is that when you practice curiosity, it will strengthen the relationships of with the person you are practicing that curiosity with. So whether that is your child, whether that is your parent, a friend, a colleague, or even a stranger who has a very different view from you or a set of identities from you. If you practice curiosity, you will feel closer to them and you will strengthen your relationship to them. And so I know that to be true. And that is something that we absolutely need right now in our country. We are in an era of division and also an era of social disconnection and isolation. We need to build relationships with our family, our friends, our peers, our neighbors, and we need to have practices that allow us to do that. And curiosity is something that we are all born with. We know that through the research, and so we see it, around young people, like babies, the way that they
Right.
get curious about the world around them and the way that they babble if they are verbal and they, practice, construction of language by getting curious about their vocal anatomy. And so, I really feel, I'm not saying that me going to like, a rally is going to change anyone's potential, voting habits or behaviors. Like that is not what I'm saying. There is other kinds of work that we collectively need to do around our country. But when it comes to connection, when it comes to us not canceling people because they hold a different identity or ideology from us, when it comes to how do we not other people, groups of people, and instead create a bigger, community of belonging where we all feel like we are seen and valued here in this community or in this country. When I'm talking about, how do we express love to one another? How do we say, I am curious about you and I want to know your story because I care about you, because I love you, because you're my kid, you're my parent, you're my neighbor. I think that is really what I'm talking about as a benefit for curiosity. And we often think about curiosity as this intellectual trait. How do I learn something from, the news or reading a book or going online? But that is only a part of curiosity, one part of it. We have to bring curiosity from the mind down into the heart. And that's what I call, heart-centered curiosity. And because there, when we are curious about other people around us, or even about myself or ourselves, we can really strengthen our connection to ourselves or the people around us. And I think that's really the gift and the value of curiosity.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think there is a sense of like intellectual curiosity. Okay, so I'm going to read this book so I can add more knowledge to my
Hmm.
brain,
Hmm.
and whatnots. But curiosity can also go on so many different levels, which you talk
Hmm.
about in your book. From deep to
Hmm.
shallow. To
Hmm.
why is the sky blue? That
Hmm.
kind of I think the ultimate question that we all ask
Hmm.
at some point
Hmm.
in our lives.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the spectrum of curiosity from shallow curiosity to deep curiosity?
Yeah, so there's a difference between intellectual and heart-centered curiosity, but there's also a difference between shallow and deep curiosity. So shallow curiosity is when we are getting to know someone, let's say, and we ask questions like, "Oh, what's your name? What do you do for work? Where do you live? What city or town are you in?" Those are great initial curiosities. They help you to get data about who a person is, but they don't really tell you the stories of that
Mhm.
person or the values of that person. They don't take you deeper, in other words. So that's because it's the shallow end of curiosity. But as you move down the spectrum towards the deep end of curiosity, you start to dive beneath the surface. You start to really uncover who this person really is. And so the quality of your questions begin to change. And so instead of asking a question like, "Oh, what's your name?" you might ask, "What's the story of your name? Like, where does your name come from? Or why were you named that? Or who named you? Tell me more about those relationships in your lives." Instead of asking a question like, "Where do you live?" you might ask, "What does home mean to you? What does it feel like to you? Who's a part of, that broader home for you if it's not just the place?" And instead of asking a question like, "What do you do for work?" you might ask, like, "What's exciting you right now in life?" Or "What's really pissing you off right now in life?" Or "What's challenging you right now
Mhm.
in life?" And it just gives you a deeper understanding of this person because they're able to share stories. They're able to share, beyond maybe just a yes or no or like a data point that they're so used to giving that we sometimes get into the routine of, right? Like we often call that small talk, but we need to have big talk. We need to
Right.
we need to take our curiosity deeper. And I'm not saying to everyone that's listening to go out,
Right.
to like the grocery store and turn to someone and say like, "What's your biggest childhood trauma? What's the most horrible thing that happened to you?"
Right. Right.
Like that's
Right.
probably not like the best moment
Like
to
good time.
like
There's a time
drop.
and place for big
Yeah,
talk.
there's a time and place for big talk for deep curiosity. Maybe not when people are at Trader Joe's,
Right.
but I think what's important is to also not demonize shallow curiosity in that way because
Sure.
it is so important to build real trust and real relationships with people before you dive into the deep curiosity, before you have earned it, really, to earn the answers from people, to earn the curiosities that you have. I always say your curiosity is earned, it is not deserved. So in other words, you might have curiosities about someone's, health conditions that they're going through, or something that's happening with their kids at home, or, curiosities about their culture, whatever it is, does not mean that you deserve your curiosity to be met if you do not have the trust and the relationship built. So I don't want to demonize shallow curiosity. It's such an important building block for relationships, but we can't just hang out there and stay there, especially with the people we love the most.
Right, and especially since it does, like you said, it's a building block, so it gets to the big talk, right? You start with the small talk, gets to the big talk, and I do find most people want to share, but you have to give them or make them feel safe and comfortable to have those conversations. And it's funny because as you're asking or as you're stating those questions, I'm like, ooh, what would my answers be? So it's going to be a lot more layered after this conversation, and also because it links to something that you wrote in your book too, because you had said that we live in a culture and world that prioritizes answers over questions, and so it sounds like in order to be curious, you also have to be comfortable. It sounds like maybe both asking the questions, or perhaps you might not get an answer back. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think a big mantra that I always say is people who feel seen, stay. People who feel seen, stay. And so what I mean by that is when you use your curiosity towards, let's say, your partner or to, someone else in your life, and you ask them questions and you're genuinely interested in them, even if you've been with them for a year or 10 years or 30, your relentless curiosity to witness their growth really helps them to feel seen and valued, which encourages them to stay engaged in that conversation, but also to stay, period. And why I think that's I think that is really important. You also cannot only be curious. You also have to be seeing yourself. And so I always say, don't ask someone a question or don't get curious about something you're not willing to answer, because that's a little bit disingenuous and I would even say predatory. And at best, it's disassociative because you're not willing to also reveal parts of you. You're not willing to be vulnerable. You're not willing to meet that person where you're trying to get them to come to. And so, I think in addition to being curious, you have to really open yourself up to the curiosity of others. It's the only way that this is going to lead to stronger relationships. If you ask someone the story of their name and they share that with you, and then they ask you that question back, you should be able to, share your perspectives on that question. And so I think in that way, the questions really are so important in both directions.
Right, because the trust goes in both directions.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this has been an amazing first moments of this conversation. This hour, we're exploring how being curious can help you through challenging times with author Scott Shigeoka. Coming up next, we'll talk about the importance of asking questions and what happens when we're incurious. And a reminder to our listeners, if you have a question for Scott, find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
Ventura Highway in the sunshine, where the days are longer, the nights are stronger than moonshine. You're gonna go, I know. Blowing through your hair, and the days surround your daylight. some sick hound, digging for bones. If it weren't for second chances, we'd all be alone.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Being incurious can literally kill us. That's according to author Scott Shigeoka. He did a deep dive into how being less curious can be detrimental to our mental and physical health. In his book, Seek, How Curiosity Can Transform Your Life and Change the World, he talks about the importance of reconnecting with our curiosity and learning how to use it as a superpower. And I'm joined by Scott himself to talk about just that. So earlier we were talking about the power of being curious, curiosity being a superpower. So I want to talk about the drawbacks of being incurious. And I was a little shocked to learn that it could be bad for our overall well-being. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, so, incuriosity is the opposite of curiosity. It is when we are not using it. It is when we are closing ourselves off from ourselves or the world around us, when we are not interested in exploring, when we're not interested in asking other people or ourselves questions. And even from the definition of incuriosity, I mean, I start to close up and constrict and I feel a little unwell, even saying the definition. But there has been a lot of research that sort of, backs this point. So for instance, they have found that in senior living communities, for instance, that our longevity, which is, the number of years that we will continue to be alive for, improves or increases, as we practice curiosity more. And so the more that we can get curious, especially as we age, the more likely it is that our, lifespan will extend. But also there's another term called health span, which is, it doesn't matter how long we stay alive if those years or days alive aren't healthy, aren't, actually a positive experience. And they've also similarly found that, using your curiosity can improve things like mental health outcomes, like you've mentioned. It's actually one of the best things I think we can use to counter addictions. I got to interview scholars like Dr. Judd Brewer about how they use mindfulness and curiosity interventions to help people with addictions around things like cigarettes, as an example, which obviously there's connection points there on how we can use curiosity as a tool to just live a healthier life. There's also been research that when we get curious about how can we be healthier, how can we have an improved life, we are more likely to be aware of the behaviors that we need to practice, which obviously makes it more likely that we will actually do it because we know what healthy behaviors we need to do to live longer and live healthier. So curiosity is just this companion for us to investigate the world, to investigate what we need, whether that's mentally or physically, but also socially to connect with others, which is a huge determinant for our lives and our longevity. So I just can't stress enough, like, even if you're just not even interested in the division that's happening in the world and how to solve that, or you're not even interested in connecting with the people that you love in your life, which I hope you are interested and invested in both of those things as a citizen and as, a human being and a loved one in this world. But even if that doesn't get your attention around curiosity, know that it can extend your life and it can help you to live a healthier life. So we're covering the board in terms of all the incentives for why curiosity is important. And it gives us clues likely to why curiosity is, part of our, evolution, why we are literally born with curiosity. As we look back into history, our ancestors needed this to find water, to, find food, to learn how to learn things like building tools, to, create connections with their kin, their tribe, so that they could, be safer. So it is something that even since historically we've needed as a practice for our benefit. It's just that today in our modern society, those reasons and for curiosity have changed.
It's so funny because as you were sort of describing the different levels of in curiosity, I was remembering a conversation I had with a friend who was being discharged from the military. You know, time was up, and they were going to be reintroduced into sort of society in a sense. And the person who was doing the training, they were talking about nutrition. And this friend of mine is not a fan of vegetables, so he was like, and then so the nutritionist was like, well, is there something that you like? There's got to be one vegetable, and he said peas, and she's like, okay, it's not the highest nutrition valued piece of vegetable, but then just eat it, just keep eating it. If that's going to be the one vegetable you like, then keep on eating it. And it's kind of making me feel like if you're not curious about maybe the bigger sort of picture things, but find something. There's got to be one thing that you can be curious about, and that could lead to better physical and mental health, it sounds like. And
Totally. And if I was in that situation, I'd be like, there was times when I didn't really know all the available options for vegetables or fruits, and so curiosity can even help us to expand our perspective of like what someone even means by that, right? And we start to discover like I had never had a persimmon until I was in like my mid-20s, and I was like, what? This is so incredible. How have I never had this before? And similarly, like I grew up with mango trees in my backyard in Hawaii, but some people had never had mangoes and their minds were blown, in their 30s when they had it for the first time. So I think it's like, how do we also expand our aperture of the world and of what's possible? And this also is for like the fruits and vegetables that we can intake for our life to like have a better, diet and to live a healthier life. But this also means just generally in any part of our lives where we want possibilities. So if you're searching for work, like I want to change my career, I'm not happy in it, I want to find a new job for myself or like find something new to do. Well, if you don't have a full aperture of what's possible, right, like you're going to feel very limited and very constrained. And instead, if you apply curiosity in that moment of deliberation and inquiry, and you see it as like a playful exploration of like, oh, what else is out there? What can I do? Who can I talk to just get inspired and to learn more about, what's possible out in the world of careers? I think then you have a much more fulfilling sort of journey. Same is true. Many friends who are parents, and one of the biggest learnings for them is like, how do I get curious and learn from other parents, from my own, see the way that I was parented and how that is maybe being, potentially passed down to my own children. Who can I learn from in terms of the books or the conversations I can be in so that I can show up to this, in the best way possible so that I can be present to my children? I mean, that is, again, using curiosity to expand your aperture of what is possible, so that you can really soak the most out of this precious life that we have.
Well, I wanted to ask too, would it be to ask, if you're looking for curiosity, would it be to ask the question to yourself of, what makes me curious? Because as you're talking to, I'm just thinking, I think a lot of us, when I say us, it's definitely the greater us, where I think we all grew up with a sense of curiosity, like you mentioned earlier. Kids are very curious, and perhaps you go through life, whatever your childhood is like, whatever your upbringing is like, you go into adulthood, we kind of go into it with this idea of like, we have to be a certain way at a certain time, at a certain age, and do certain things, right? And I think this conversation is happening at a really interesting time because I'm hearing from a lot of, all kinds of generations of people who are looking into their inner child, or they're looking to play as adults, which is, I think, a fairly new concept for many people. And then we have a lot more information, right? Where we can learn more about being curious as we're having this conversation today. So, if someone's coming up to you and be like, I don't know how to be curious, what would you say to them?
Well, first of all, before I even answer that, there is a myth that only the young are curious, that only children are curious. And that is just not true. When you look at the meta-analysis of, multiple research studies that cover over 1 million research participants, what you see is that we actually get more curious generally over time. So what that means is that as we age, our elders and the seniors in the world are some of the most curious people on the planet. But we have this mythology, this story that we all have subscribed to, that only children are curious because they ask all of these questions like, why is the sky blue? But or why is Bluey talking, in a different accent or whatever it is.
Right.
And so try to update that question for the times. But, we change the way that we express our curiosity, and what we get curious about also changes. We don't get less curious necessarily. It just looks a little different.
Sure.
Like we might start to be inwardly curious about our emotional landscape. I mean, I know some very emotionally intelligent children who are doing this, but like that's something we learn to do as we grow older. Like you said, exploring, our past experiences when we were children and how that impacts our behaviors now. Getting curious about the divine or consciousness or whatever it is that you're, getting curious about changes and expresses in different ways. So I want everyone listening to know that you don't lose your curiosity. That is not something that is happening. You're actually growing in your capacity for curiosity, as you age. And a big part of that is because it's like a muscle. Curiosity is like a muscle, and you are practicing it every day, whether you realize it intentionally or not, consciously or not, that you are practicing it in your own life, your own relationships, your work, your parenting, your, moving through the world day to day. So I'll start with that, which I think is helpful because knowing that you already have this capacity inside of you, it's a muscle you're already born with that you are constantly exercising, is such a confidence builder for people as they're like, how do I get curious? It's like, no.
You already are.
You're already getting curious. It's really about having this like curiosity, confidence about seeing the tools or the practices that you can bring into your life to just strengthen this muscle. That's more what it's about. So as I think about those practices, like a couple that come to mind. One is this idea of sort of perspective taking and giving is what we call it in psychology, but that's really about asking other people questions to get to know their experiences and their stories and allowing people to ask you questions so you can share your own stories and your own values and your own perspectives. That exchange is such a great way to build conversations, relationships, but also to just strengthen your curiosity. Another way to do it is before you even enter into those conversations, practice a visualization. This is what elite athletes do before they do, many of them do before performances. They envision themselves doing their floor routine. A gymnast might do that, or, someone might imagine themselves, throwing a free throw at a free throw line, or thinking about the play that they're going to do, in the next game. We can do the same thing as curious people to prepare for our conversations. What are the kinds of questions I'm going to ask? What setting are we going to be in that's going to be best suited for us to be curious towards one another, to be safe in that curiosity? How am I going to prepare my body and my mind for that experience? For instance, getting well rested, maybe not, getting too intoxicated if you drink, maybe, not being distracted at the time, like driving, your teen from school in really heavy, chaotic traffic, trying to get curious. That might not be the best setting to get curious in. So how do you really be intentional and visualize where are we going to be and how am I actually going to be practicing my curiosity in this next sort of interaction? And then the final thing I'll share, and there's so many other of these practices in the book Seek, by the way, but another practice that's very simple that goes back to vegetables, I think is why it was triggered in my mind.
There you go.
It's actually been shown to reduce prejudice when we do something called the vegetable challenge, which is imagining, does this person that I'm about to talk to or talking to like broccoli or carrots or peas or asparagus? Like you can pick the two. They use broccoli and carrots in the research study. And the idea behind it is that when you're asking yourself that question, what you're really doing is seeing the individuality of the person in front of you. They are no longer just these boxes of categories like Democratic, Asian American, queer, you start to see them as like, oh, Scott also is on team broccoli, likes broccoli, has a preference towards broccoli. Other Asian Americans or other queer people might have a preference for carrots, so wow, there's a spectrum of differences in a single group. They're not monoliths, right? No two Asian Americans are the same. No two, 45-year-olds are the same. No two university professors are the same. No two Democrats are the same. So that's what it really exercises, is getting curious about what is this person's individual preferences? What are their likes? What are their dislikes? And you can explore that using your curiosity, which will help you to reduce some of that prejudice that you might be experiencing towards them.
Well, it must have been because I was reading that research. Therefore, the idea of green peas came into my mind. So it came back full circle, actually.
Yeah. Something triggered something. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
You've been listening to Scott Shigeoka, who's the author of Seek: How Curiosity Can Transform Your Life and Change the World. Coming up next, we hear more about how curiosity can be contagious. Join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
It's the end of the line and I can't find my way home. It's the end of the line and I can't find my way home. My way home. My way.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're being curious about curiosity. Our guest is Scott Shigeoka. He's an internationally recognized curiosity expert and speaker. His book is called Seek: How Curiosity Can Transform Your Life and Change the World. So, Scott, earlier we were talking about being curious, curiosity being a superpower, and also the drawbacks of being incurious. So now I'm curious to hear, is curiosity contagious? Is it an act of courage? Because we've been talking about how, being curious can be a part of a process of working through your fears and crossing barriers.
Well, first of all, it is an act of courage. Bravery is this idea that fear does not exist, that you're fearless. But, to me, at least, encourages, the idea that we have the fear, we feel the fear, but we do it anyway because we know that this is something that is needed. And I think that is what curiosity is. It really is an act of courage. Oftentimes it can feel really scary for people to take, especially their curiosity deeper. Like, should I ask my parents this question? Should I ask my child this question? Should I ask my neighbor this question? Will I be invading their privacy, or will they think I'm weird? Will this turn into like an awkward conversation? There's all these fears that we have. Will they reject me for asking the question? And oftentimes what does happen, though, is that people are really thirsting for this. People really want to feel seen and want these questions to be asked, and love sharing their own perspectives and their own stories, and love to be listened to genuinely. And so when you do work up the courage to, finally ask those deeply curious questions, you find that it's actually what you're giving them as a gift in a way, because they are so happy to share, and so happy to be heard, and they feel like they really matter in that moment, and because they do. And that act is so infectious that, a lot of emerging research, and I think we should do more research on this, but it's finding that when I am practicing curiosity towards someone like you, you are more likely to practice it towards me. And many researchers like Todd Cashin have, described this as like the give and take spiral. You get into a conversation where you're meeting a friend, you're doing a catch up, and like you're asking questions, they're asking questions. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's back and forth. And you're just like learning so much about each other's lives. And it feels good. It feels really good. We know that it releases dopamine, which is the happy hormone. It's a pleasurable experience to be curious, and so we want to do it, just like we want to eat a tasty meal, or we want to win an award, because
Right.
These actions give us a sense of evolutionary protection or survival, and that's why it makes us feel good, because our brains want us to, sort of incentivize these behaviors. And so it makes sense that something that feels good, that gives us pleasure, is something that we're going to want to do more of, and that it activates that, desire in other people as well. And so that's why I sort of wrote this chapter as Curiosity is Contagious, because it can feel really overwhelming sometimes to think about all of the problems that we have in our world, and we have an F ton of them. And I think what's been really, really helpful is recognizing that division, social isolation, disconnection. These all are huge issues that feel very, very hard for how does a single person, even try to solve these things? But you don't have to, solve it for the entire world. Really, what you have to do is like look at the people around you or even within yourself and start practicing this curiosity and know that by doing that, you are going to inspire and motivate others to do the same. And whether you feel it personally, you might, in that given interaction, feel the curiosity coming back to you. But oftentimes you might not see it. You might be curious, you might ask questions, they don't return the favor, but you have to know that maybe in another interaction they're having, you planted a seed in their mind that makes them curious towards another person. And so, that's why we talk a lot about the differences between generalized and specific reciprocity. Everything's not always going to be specific, which means that I ask you a question, you ask me a question, I ask you a question, you ask me a question. It's more generalized sometimes. Like I ask you a question, you ask someone else a question, that same one, because it inspired you, they ask someone else, and it creates this beautiful ripple effect. And I think that's what we're trying to create here is how do we just on our own practice curiosity with the people closest to us that we love. We don't have to all go out to a political rally of, a different persuasion. We can just start at home, at least in the beginning, and with people that we trust and feel safe with, and just like practice getting a little more curious. Practice taking your curiosity a little bit deeper. When your partner comes and says something that they're really excited about, in their lives, instead of saying, "That's great, honey," like remind yourself, pause, remind yourself, how can I get a little bit curious? Tell me more about why this is exciting you. Oh my gosh, like who are you there with? Oh my, what did it feel like for all of you? As you continue to take your curiosity deeper, what I promise you will find, because I've talked to tens of thousands of people now at this point since the book came out, is that you will feel a closeness to this person. You will feel the benefits of this relationship strengthening. It's just that we sometimes get into this pattern or behavior of closing ourselves off from curiosity by saying, I've been married to this person for so long, there's nothing more I could learn from them. I'm certain about that. That is not true. We have to replace our certainty with curiosity. We have to be relentless about it. And when we do that, we find that so much positive things come to our lives and to the lives around us.
When you mentioned your book that you raise a glass to dopamine, so I'm here raising a glass to dopamine with you because speaking of dopamine, we've been having so much fun that we have no more time left. But thank you so much, Scott, for being here with us today. If there's a positive word you can leave our listeners, what word would you choose?
Curiosity is your companion. So know that it is always with you and it is always there for you as you go through this wild journey of life.
Well, thank you so much for taking on this journey with us. You've been listening to Scott Shigeoka, who's the author of Seek, How Curiosity Can Transform Your Life and Change the World. You can find more information on his book on our website, ctpublic.org/where we live. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for listening and stay curious, everyone.